What up, Wizards? It's the Big D from Mtg. There are several reasons they call me that, but we have a lot. There's a lot of Forgotten Realms spoilers since the last time I sat down on this couch yesterday. We had like 40 to go through, and that was a lot. But today, we've got like 60, so we really got to get to it. Let's go ahead and start looking at some of these cards. All right, so let's start from the bottom and work our way up, but I'm not going to waste as much of your time on the lower level stuff as I did yesterday. Like, there are some cards that only exist for the visual gag, like +2 mace. That's there. It's an equipment that costs 2 and gives a creature +2/+2 and equips for way too much, but mostly we saw a whole bunch of cards at the common and uncommon rarity today that venture into the dungeon almost incidentally, like Fate's Reversal, for instance, is a 2-mana Raise Dead that also just ventures into the dungeon. Dungeon Map is a 3-mana mana rock that taps for colorless, but you can also tap 3 and tap it to venture into the dungeon. There's also Bar the Gate. This is a 3-mana Essence Scatter that can also counter Planeswalkers that also just incidentally ventures into the dungeon. 3 mana is an awful lot, but it still is a card that exists. This Zombie Ogre costs 5 mana for a 3/5 Zombie Ogre, and it's funny, its creature type is also its name. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you venture into the dungeon. There's also Find the Path, which is 3 mana and lets a land tap for 2 green mana, but you also venture into the dungeon when it ETBs. Volo, this I don't even have to translate. This is flying. It's just fly is the name of the card. It gives the creature that it's enchanted on flying, and whenever the creature does combat damage, you venture into the dungeon. So that's a really cheap way of doing it. But there are plenty of ways of doing it cheaply. One of my favorite is Kick in the Door. This is just 1 red mana for a sorcery. It puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature. That creature gains haste until end of turn. It can't be blocked by walls, and then you venture into the dungeon. That's a lot of value for 1 mana. There's also Intrepid Outlander, which is a 2-mana 2/3 Orc Ranger with Reach, a pretty decent little package in terms of stats already, but it also has another instance of Pack Tactics. We saw 2 of these yesterday. This appears to be an actual mechanic and not just a one-off italicized bit of flavor text. Anyway, whenever Intrepid Outlander attacks, if you attack with creature's total power of 6 or greater this combat, you venture into the dungeon. We also saw Ranger's Hawk. This is just a 1-mana 1/1 flyer in white, and you can pay 3 and tap it and another untapped creature you control to venture into the dungeon. So we saw a lot of venture into the dungeon stuff. If you were worried that it wouldn't be supported enough in Limited, then I think today assuages those fears. We even got to see some slightly higher rarity stuff that works pretty well with venturing, like Hama Pashar, Ruin Seeker. This is 3 mana, 1 a white and a blue for a 2/3 legendary human wizard. Room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time, which is actually kind of really sweet in your blue-white dungeons deck, I suppose. But we also saw some rares even that go pretty well with this theme, like Dungeon Descent, which is a land that taps for colorless, and you can pay 4 and tap it, and tap an untapped legendary creature you control to venture into the dungeon. Now, you can only do that as a sorcery, and Dungeon Descent enters the battlefield tapped for some reason. So the dungeon land has been nerfed even more than like base camp, the party land. I really don't understand why this comes into play tapped. But anyway, there's also Zalto, Fire Giant Duke. Pretty sweet dude right here. He's 5 mana, 3 and 2 red for a 7/3 legendary giant barbarian with trample. And whenever he's dealt damage, you venture into the dungeon. So that's kind of neat. Your opponent's incentivized to block the 7 power trample guy, probably. So it's very likely that he will take damage and you'll venture. The only problem is he'll likely die on blocks, so that's a problem. Triumphant Adventurer, though, is one that I really like in terms of all these rare Enter the Dungeon cards. Triumphant Adventurer is just 2 mana in Orzhov colors for a 1/1 human knight with Death Touch, and as long as it's your turn, it has First Strike. Obviously, shouldn't have to tell you, First Strike and Death Touch is a pretty sweet combination, but whenever it attacks, you venture into the dungeon, so it doesn't even have to deal combat damage or anything. I mean, the worst part about this is obviously the stat line for your 2 mana investment, but First Strike and Death Touch is a pretty sweet thing to have. Now, you probably do have to grow this in some way through anthem effects or equipments or auras or something to make it truly dangerous, but I still think this is a pretty sweet card and one of the better venture into the dungeon cards that we've seen. Oh yeah, I also missed Barrow-in. Get it? Barrow-in of Clan Under. This is 4 mana. That's a lot. 2, a white and a black for a 3/3 legendary dwarf cleric, and when it enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. Whenever it attacks, you return up to 1 creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield if you've completed a dungeon. So this is probably bad. I mean, it's an uncommon legend. Sometimes those are good, sometimes those are bad, but often when they cost 4 mana, they're not great. And I think this is one of those instances. This is just a little bit too much mana for something that doesn't really do much outside of its ETB trigger, has a very low stat line, no real keyword abilities or anything, and only really pops off when you've completed a dungeon, which takes God knows how long. Now, another thematic thing that happened today is it turns out Treasure Chest isn't the only thing that rolls a d20. This is a recurring theme in the set, and I love it. Spiked Pit Trap just costs 1 mana to cast. It's an artifact with flash for some reason. You can pay 5 and tap it to choose a creature, then roll a d20. Now, on a 1 through 9, it deals 5 damage to the creature. But on a 10 through 20, it deals 5 damage to the creature, and you create a treasure token, which is really kind of neat. There's actually a lot of stuff today that creates treasure tokens. Like improvised weaponry. This is 3 mana, 2 and a red for a sorcery that deals 2 damage to a target, and you create a treasure token. Now, it sucks that this is a sorcery. This really ought to be an instant, but at sorcery speed, it's probably just meant for limited play, but still, kill that guy, create a treasure token is pretty good. I mean, it's basically a Prismari command at sorcery speed that chooses 2 of the modes for you, but I'll take this in the limited environment. It's not bad. We also saw Chaos Channeler. This is 4 mana, 2 and 2 red for a 4/3 human shaman with Wild Magic Surge. Whenever it attacks, you roll a d20. It's a wild name for that ability. On a 1 through 9, you exile the top card of your library and you can play it this turn. On a 10 through 19, you do that, but you get 2 cards instead. And then on a 20, you exile the top 3 and you may play them this turn. So this is always going to be some form of kind of card advantage in red, the way we've been seeing it these last few sets. But this is probably not great outside of limited either, honestly. The body is not amazing, and it has to wait to attack to do anything. So there's just better 4-drop options in most standard decks. But it's a really sweet card. Same thing with Earth Cult Elemental. This is 6 mana, 4 and 2 red for a 6/6 elemental with Siege Monster. When it ETBs, roll a d20. On a 1 through 9, each player sacks a permanent. On a 10 through 19, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. And on a 20, each opponent sacrifices dose permanents, which is pretty sweet when you do roll the 20, but you know, you're at 6 mana when you cast this, so they probably got to land in like an inconsequential thing rolling around, even if you manage to roll a natural crit. We also saw Farida's Fireball today, 5 mana, 3 and 2 red for an instant, and it deals 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker, and then you roll a d20. On a 1 through 9, it deals 2 damage to each player, and on a 10 through 20, it shocks an opponent and not you. So not an amazing card, but again, decent little commented piece of limited removal. But the reason that I bring most of these up is to talk about Farida Devil's Chosen. This is 4 mana, 2, a blue, and a red for a 3/3 Tiefling Warlock. And whenever you roll a die, Farida gets Menace and Flying until end of turn. If any of those result in a 10 or higher, you also draw a card, which is like really sweet. that's really quite good. On a d20, you're 50% to roll a 10 or higher, and so that's not actually, you're slightly better than 50% to roll a 10 or higher, because from 10 to the 20 there are 11 numbers, right? But there's only 9 numbers for all 1 through 9, so that's not actually a bad chance to draw a card. And Flying in Menace is pretty sweet too. It's going to be really difficult to block her. So sweet little fun commander here that I don't think is super competitively viable, but obviously, but in Commander this will be nothing but fun. And on those cards where you get to roll 2d6 or something, you'll still get to draw a card sometimes. Just a cool little card. But I kind of want to get back to some of these cards that create treasure tokens, because there's a few of them I'm kind of excited about. Shambling Ghast, for instance, is just a black mana for a 1/1 zombie, but when it dies you choose one. You either Brave the Stench and give target creature an opponent controls -1/-1 till end of turn, or you search the body and create a treasure token. So a 1 mana 1/1 is obviously not a huge deal, but it's got a good creature type, sort of, and, it creates a treasure when it dies, which is actually kind of sweet. It's no Thrabid Inspector, but I'll take it. It's not terrible. There's also You Find a Cursed Idol, and we saw a few of these Dungeon Master scenario cards today, and these just continue to look pretty good. But You Find a Cursed Idol might be possibly one of the better naturalizes I've ever seen in my life. This is 2 mana, 1 and a green for sorcery, so it's not an instant. I'll actually retract my previous statement. I hate sorceries. But you choose one, smash it, destroy an artifact. Lift the Curse, destroy an enchantment. Or steal its eyes to create a treasure token and venture into the dungeon. 2 mana at sorcery speed, create a treasure token, venture into the dungeon. Could actually be okay. There's also Merchant of Skullport. This is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 1/4 dwarf citizen. And when it ETBs, you create a treasure token. You can also pay 1 and a black and sack another creature or a treasure to draw a card. So converting all of your treasure making into card drawing is actually very good. I mean, I think the dude costs a mana too much And if he costs 2 mana, he'd probably be a 1/3. But that extra point of toughness might matter a good bit. He blocks pretty effectively, and is really good against all the X ones in the format and stuff. But I'm still not super sure the guy actually sees much standard play. But a guy that ETBs to create a treasure token is typically quite good, so I don't mind this dude. Especially if he can like draw you a couple of cards over the course of the game. This guy might actually be like a tireless tracker that doesn't get bigger. Think about that. It could be better than we think. But let's get on to the rest of these You Do a Thing cards, these Dungeon Master scenarios that we saw today. We saw you're ambushed on the road. Just a single white mana for an instant. You choose one. Make a retreat. Return target creature you control to its owner's hand. Stand and fight. Target creature gets +1/+3 until end of turn. So for just 1 mana, I think one of the best homes for this could be the mono white or white X like Lumimancer, those Magecraft decks with Leonin Lightscribe and Clever Lumimancer. This could actually be really sweet to save one of your guys or just have an extra spell to pump your dudes with. So, I don't know. Could actually see some sparing play in that, especially post-rotation. But we also saw you find some prisoners. This is really interesting to me. 2 mana, 1 and a red for an instant. So we see a card that should be an instant and sorcery, and a card that should be a sorcery gets instant speed. You can choose one to break their chains and destroy target artifact. It's a cool mode, and I think you're going to use it more than we think you're going to use it, but Interrogate Them is the interesting mode on this. You exile the top 3 cards of target opponent's library. Choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. So that's actually not bad. You can do this EOT, or maybe even like during your opponent's combat step, trip them up. But you can do it on your opponent's turn. And then till the end of your next turn, you can cast the best card from those top 3, or the card that you can cast because you have the mana to do it, or whatever. You know, you rip a 5 mana card you really want to play, but you only have 3 mana, so you gotta go pull the 3-drop or whatever. But still, looking at their top 3 is a lot. That's a ton of cards. You're not quite drawing 3 or anything, but that's so many cards to look at and get the best one. And you get to untap before, you know, the card is gone forever. So I like this a good bit, and I'm not really sure if it fits anywhere, which is my major problem with it or anything. But at the same time, I think that it does enough to be cool enough to be labbed with. Let me put it that way. We also saw You Happen Upon a Glade. This is 3 mana, 2 and a green for an instant. You choose one. Search your library for up to 2 basic lands, reveal them, put them in your hand and shuffle, or make camp. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So when I first read this morning, I was as I read through it, I thought it was just going to be a strictly Better Cultivate, and I started to sweat a little bit, but no, it doesn't put any lands out. It just puts them into your hand, which is subpar. And then obviously the second mode on is just Balaged Recovery, but I think I'd just rather have Balaged Recovery in my deck than have the option to go get 2 lands. I mean, be nice when you're getting mana screwed and all that, but spending 3 mana to not really affect the board state in any way, you don't even get to put one of those lands out, is kind of a massive feel bad. So I'm not a huge fan of this to be instant, to be honest, but I will say it's an instant. That was the next thing I was going to say, so I got my words mixed up. I will say it's an instant, so being able to like regrow something at the end of your opponent's turn is not half bad. But there's also You Come to the Knoll Camp. This is 2 mana, 1 and a red for an instant, where you choose one, of course. You Intimidate Them, which is up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn. Or you Fend Them Off. Target creature gets +3/+1 till end of turn. A nice little limited combat trick. Sometimes you'll use this to pump a creature and save it, or trade when you normally wouldn't have, or maybe a creature went unblocked and you get a bolt's worth of extra damage in. And then sometimes you get a bunch of extra damage in because your opponent only has like 3 or 4 creatures out, and you let the 2 biggest guys can't block this turn, and you Alpha Strike. Like, that could be really good. And again, I don't think that this sees a whole lot of standard play. I don't think it's worth a slot in this day and age where Mono Red has so many powerful tools. You know, yesterday I was talking about Dueling Rapier, and I made it sound like I really like that card, and it gets a slot. No, I don't think it gets a slot. A Whimper Cleave is doing, you know, Embarrass Cleave is a is Dueling Rapier, but it looks okay. This, I kind of have the same feelings about. It looks like a sweet card, but I'm just not sure where it picks up a slot. Now, there were a number of other commons and uncommons today that don't really fit into any of the previously established themes, but I still think were really, really sweet. Like this Clever Conjurer. This doesn't look like much. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/3 Gnome Wizard with Mage Hand. Untap target permanent not named Clever Conjurer. Why can't I get the name right? Activate only as a sorcery. This does a cool number of things in the format. It's kind of a Kelpie guide that doesn't have the other bit of text where you can tap something an opponent controls. But that is like it's not used very often on Kelpie guide. The reason Kelpie Guide is used is mono blue ramp because it can untap lands, and this can do the same thing. This can also untap your Nyx Lotus in the mono blue Nyx Lotus deck, so that's something to look out for. That deck is always looking for untappers. There's also Grim Wanderer. I wanted to point this guy out because I think he's cool. 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 5/3 Goblin Warlock with Flash, and it's got tragic backstory. Which is great. You can cast the spell only if a creature died this turn, which is not super hard to make happen. I mean, at the end of your opponent's turn 3, you can, like, Village Rites your Eye Twitch, draw 2, learn, drop this guy. That seems good. That seems quite good, you know. In the right kind of mono-black aggro deck, I could see this dude being fantastic. You know, just sacrifice your Serrated Scorpion, hit him for 2, gain 2, cast this guy, like, during their combat step, you know. I just like this dude a lot, and I think for an uncommon, it looks pretty strong. There's also Feign Death. We see a card like this in just about every set, but I do like this one. It's just 1 black mana for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gains when the creature dies. Return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. It's, again, not necessarily unique kind of card, but I'm always going to like these 1 black mana, you know, basically savior guy things in black. Late last night, like right after I uploaded the video, we saw Battle Cry Goblin, which I think might be one of the better uncommons in the set so far. This is just 1 and a red for a 2/2 Goblin. You can pay 1 and a red to have goblins you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. How's that for a mana sink? But it also has Pack Tactics. Whenever it attacks, if you attack with 6 power or more in total, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. This guy looks great to me. I mean, goblins, especially these, you know, these aggro goblins decks that just like vomit their hand on the table in the first 3 turns, probably want something like this in slightly underpowered formats. You know, I don't think that this works in like modern goblins or anything, but if standard or historic goblins are a thing, I could definitely see this going in, you know. Later on into the game, you'll almost certainly be attacking with that much power relatively easily, and you're not just creating a 1/1 like it looks like. You know, you're going to have Anthem effects for all your Gabas out, sometimes 2 or 3, so you're actually making a creature of reasonable power a lot of the time. And if you just, you know, start your turn, attack with 6 power, then suddenly you have, you know, 4 mana or whatever you need to pump into this and make that goblin you created bigger, make this guy bigger. I've already forgotten his name. Battlecry Goblin. Make BCG bigger and everything else that's swinging too. So I actually like this. It's not quite an Anthem effect, but I will always take a mana sink like this for an aggro deck on like at least a decent stats. At least it's a bear. You know, 2 mana 2/2. I just like this a lot, and I think that it actually has a shot. There's a couple of more uncommons I want to cover, but then we will get into the rares and the mythics for the day, and there's some great stuff there. But some good stuff left in the uncommons, like Cridle of Baldur's Gate. That's a thing that I recognize. I've played video games. But anyway, it's a blue and a black for a 1/3 legendary human elf rogue. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses a life and mills a card, and you gain 1 life and scry 1. And whenever you attack, you may pay 2. If you do, target creature can't be blocked this turn. That's a lot on a 2 mana guy. It's just a 1/3 with no real evasion or keyword abilities of any, you know, any note. But at the same time, I will say that whenever it deals combat damage to a player is not super likely to happen, but when it does, even then it's not great. I mean, in a way, Cridle is kind of a 2/2. It's kind of a 2 power guy, at least, because, you know, if it does get through for combat damage and it does an extra damage. So I guess it might be a little better than I think, but I just don't think this is going to get through super often. And even when it does, this is a good benefit, but it's not like a massive, it doesn't put you way far ahead in the game or affect the board state or anything. And then whenever you attack, you may pay 2 and target creature cannot be blocked. So you can make Cridle go unblocked if you really want to, but that's a lot of mana to use. You know, you'll probably be using this later on in the game. These rogues decks like this might go into don't want to spend much mana on their turn, so I'm just not sure how often it's going to be that much worth it to you to get this ability off. But if you have extra mana laying around, and you can like still drown or buy Lurrus or whatever, then like, yeah, you'll use the ability. And sometimes you'll let your Lurrus go unblocked to deal a big chunk of damage, or Soaring Thought Thief that has a big, you know, if you have 2 or 3 Soaring Thought Thieves out and like, you know, your Soaring Thought Thief is a 4 power dude or whatever, then maybe you let that go through unblocked. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff this could do, but at the end of the day, y'all, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I don't think that Rogues has the slots. It's really, really tight right now, and even though there's a few different ways to make that deck, I just don't see them wanting, a not flash 2-drop that doesn't do enough. But we'll move on to Targnar, Demon Fanged. I'm pretty sure I recognize this guy's name too, but I'm sure a lot of people are going to be upset he's just an uncommon. But it's a red and a green for a 2/2 legendary Null with pack tactics. You know what that means. You attack with 6 power worth of dudes. Attacking creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. But anyway, you can also pay 2 a red and a green and double the number of power and toughness of Targnar. So it becomes a 4/4, and then I guess if you have an 8 mana, it becomes an 8/8. It's not bad. I mean, it's not a terrible mana sink for late in the game to have access to, so it's not bad. And obviously, if you attack with total power 6 or greater, then he gets even bigger, and then when you double his power, it gets even more. And maybe you double his power before combat. That way you only have to have like a 2/2 swinging with him to proc this. So, I could actually see this dude being pretty sweet, but again, we've reached a problem where I'm not sure this is as good as a card that currently exists in Standard. Do you play this over like Brushfire Elemental? And Brushfire Elemental doesn't even rotate, so I'm just not sure this is quite good enough, but it is a sweet card that if you have a big enough team, can do some really good stuff for you. Oh, whoops, I missed a 4-mana legendary uncommon. I wouldn't want to do that. So here's Shesra, Death's Whisper here. This is 4 mana, 2 a black and a green for a 1/3 legendary human elf warlock with Bewitching Whispers. So when Shesra enters the battlefield, target creature blocks this turn if able. Why can't I talk? Whispers of the Grave. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 2 life. If you do, draw a card. Why did I pay 2 life for this? Why is it 4 mana? Why is it a 1/3 for my 4 mana investment? This card is kind of garbage looking to me, and I hate to be too hard on any one card because I'm not that negative of a person. And I tend to see the good things in both people and Magic cards rather than the negative. But I can't help myself but kind of poop on this one a little bit. The ETB trigger is, I like ETB triggers. This one's not great. Having to pay 2 life is dumb. I only get to draw 1 card. I can sacrifice my whole team to a Plumb the Forbidden, lose a bunch of life, and then I have to pay 2 more life to draw an extra card? Nah, no thanks. You're not going in my Dina deck. Next. Up next, let's look at white here. This is 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 3/2 zombie soldier that ETB's tapped for no real reason. You can also have Life Drain. Whenever a creature dealt damage by white this turn dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token and exile that card. So this is actually kind of okay. Maybe Wizards thought that if it didn't need to be tapped, it could block and be too good, but I don't think so. I think the whole point of this card is that it's a 2 mana with decent stats that probably does die on blocks, but when it dies on blocks, it trades, and then you get a 2/2. So you count 2 for 1 your opponent, right? You lose a guy, they lose a guy. But you're up on in terms of board presence because you get a 2/2. But that's probably not, it's still not good enough. I don't know why it's rare. Maybe I'm just really misjudging the amount of value that this card gets you. This might be one of the more aggressive value 2-drops that we've seen in black for a while, so I don't want to poop on it. It might actually be way better than I think. So we don't really see a whole lot of black 2-drops with 3 power that are actually decently playable outside of Black Lance Paragon. So again, this is probably better than I'm judging it as because the value is decent there. I just absolutely hate that it comes into play tapped, unreasonably so. Now let's look at Wish. This is 2 and a red for a sorcery, and you may play a card you own from outside the game this turn. So there's some timing restrictions, some addendums, a few quid pro quos, and all that. 3 mana is kind of a lot to be expected to also cast the card that you wish for. This does take up a sideboard slot and all that, just like all the other Fae of Wishes and Living Wish and Burning Wish, all that stuff. Only this time they just called it Wish. It's kind of a lazy naming convention, but I mean, eventually a card just had to be named Wished, just had to. Hell, they named the last one Granted, so let's get even more literal this time and call it Wish. But in any case, I think this is all right, but not amazing. I've seen people talk about this could see legacy play, and I think that's probably where it's most at home, because a lot of the stuff you're going to be searching up is just 1 to 3 mana, and you can afford to cast it on the same turn you cast Wish, where as a lot of the stuff I like to wish for with a Fae of Wishes is expensive. I like to search for a giant haymaker with Fae of Wishes and usually play it on the next turn. But there are a lot of Magic players who advocate for when you play Fae of Wishes right now, you need to play a wish board full of 1 and 2 drops, so you can actually afford to cast the spell. And you can do that with this too. You can go get a Heartless Act and play it or something for just 5 mana, which isn't a terrible rate. It's really not. When you need the Heartless Act right now. But if you need a sweeper or something, you're going to end up paying 7 mana for this and the sweeper, and that's probably too much. So I don't know. Maybe in combo decks where this effectively allows you to play any win conditions outside of the main deck, which is one of my favorite things to do with Wishes. I could see this working because, like, you don't care if you go get your win condition on turn 8. You know, your deck is slow, control-y, grindy. It just wants to take control of the game state. And once it does that with its 10 mana, it can go get whatever it wants, basically. So maybe the card is better than I think when wishing for expensive stuff, depending on what kind of deck it's in. But you can tell we're getting into the good stuff because we're going to look at Oswald Fiddlebender right here. That's a name. He's just 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 2/2 legendary Gnome Artificer. I want to say I've actually heard of this guy before, even though I don't play much D&D. But anyway, the important part of this card is the activated ability. Pay a white, tap it, and sack an artifact to search your library for an artifact card whose mana value is equal to the mana value of the sacrificed artifact +1. Put it on the battlefield, shuffle your library, activate this only as a sorcery. So it's a worrying pod. It's a birthing pod, but just for artifacts, which is dope. It's pretty good. I'm not really sure how much standard play this sees, but I say that a lot. I'm trying to be like a little more critical these last couple of seasons, which wasn't hard during Strixhaven spoiler season. But anyway, this is probably a little bit slow, and it dies to Bone Crusher. And I'm just really not sure that this is a standard playable card at the moment. Maybe we see like better and more playable artifacts. This becomes good. I could see this seeing play in like the mono white Ugin deck that plays a bunch of sweepers, but also plays a ton of artifacts for, you know, Forsaken Monuments. So, you know, maybe you spin into a Forsaken Monument off of a 4-drop. You know, you play your Solemn Simulacrum, go get a basic land, and then sack it to this guy and go get your Forsaken Monument, and you get to draw a card. So it's like, that seems okay, you know. But I mostly see this in Commander, where it's probably one of the more hype white commanders in a really long time, since like SRAM. I haven't gotten this excited over getting to play a white commander since at least SRAM. Well, Mangara. Yeah, SRAM was the one I was more excited about. But yeah, Fiddlebender looks really sweet in that format, where even if it does die to some form of removal, it's not super hard to play it over again and start doing some gross stuff with it, you know. If you can somehow untap it multiple times over the course of a turn, then you can like do the pod chain, you know, where you go get you sack a 1-cost thing to get a 2-cost thing. And you sack the 2-cost thing to get a 3-cost thing, untap them, sack the 3-cost thing to get a 4-cost thing. It could work if you want to chain activations of this, so long as you can untap stuff. Like, you go get a Corridor Monitor, right? You sacrifice a 1 casting cost guy. Go get a Corridor Monitor. It's an artifact. It untaps your dude. It untaps Fiddlebender. And you can sack the Corridor Monitor to go get a 3-drop. I mean, this works. I'm just not sure how good it is. Honestly, but I want to try all kinds of fun stuff with Fiddlebender, both in standard, historic, well, all three, standard, historic, and commander. I think there's just no end to the broken stuff this guy can do. Now, usually I go in order of how good I think a card is, all in all, but today I'm kind of going in order of how excited I am about getting to talk about a card. So let's talk about Dragon Turtle after Fiddlebender, because it's a Dragon Turtle. The card doesn't even have to have printed text on it. I'm just glad it's a Dragon Turtle. But anyway, it's another one of those creatures that has the same creature types as its name. It's a Dragon Turtle. Its types are Dragon Turtle. But it's a 3-mana, 3/5, 1 and 2 blue, by the way. With Flash, which I think is one of the keys to this card. And when it ETBs, you tap it and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. They don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. That's really interesting because you'll still get to swing with your guy first. And even if you don't swing with Dragon Turtle, it can probably block whatever you tapped because it has 5 freaking toughness. You know? Unless it taps like a Lovestruck Beast down. It's going to have an easy time blocking nearly anything and surviving, or even killing the thing that you tap down, you know. 3 mana for a 3/5 Flash is actually a pretty good stat line, so this is pushed just a little bit, but I'm not sure even then that it ends up seeing much play. I mean, it's pseudo tempo-based removal, and in a tempo deck, and we've already talked about mono blue tempo a couple of times this spoiler season. In a mono blue tempo deck, this could be fantastic because it generates really good tempo, and when you do get to attack with it, I mean, you got to flash it in. It's a 3-power guy for just 3 mana. It got the biggest creature on your opponent's side of the table off your back for 2 turns. I mean, this is actually, I think, a pretty decent card. And, you know, I was kind of making a joke about it when I was like, oh, this isn't as good as Fiddlebender, but I'm still going to talk about it after Fiddlebender. I don't know. In Standard, this could actually see more play than Fiddlebender at the end of the day. It's not a bad card. It's really not. But don't look now. We've made it to the final card of the day. How did that happen so quickly? Here's Zariel, Archduke of Avernus. For a while, I thought it was Archduke of Avenues because the whip is kind of covering up the name, but it's Archduke of Avernus. It costs 4 mana. 2 and 2 red for a 4 loyalty planeswalker with +1. Creatures you control get +1/+0, gain haste till end of turn. The 0 is the 3 mana Tybalt's -1, I think, or -2. Create a 1/1 red devil creature token with when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. So create a Footlight Fiend. And for -6, you get an emblem with at the end of the first combat phase on your turn, untap target creature you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. This is really sweet looking in like Luca or Transmogrified decks. You know, on turn 4, you play this, you make a dude, and on turn 5, you play Luca. You exile the guy. You don't get the Footlight Fiend trigger off of it in that case, but you still exile the guy and go and get like the biggest dude in your entire deck and swing with it. Now, cool thing about that is not only did this provide the token, but if you ever get the emblem off of this, then suddenly the huge dude that you transmogrified into play can attack twice on any given turn. So if you go get like a Yadara, you probably just win the game if you have the emblem on this. Meanwhile, the +1 is really good in these kind of go wide aggro decks. You know, I'd probably just rather play like Castle Imbrith a lot of the time, but at the same time, you know, if you play a few creatures for the first few turns, you know, just empty your hand on the table, and then play this guy, then it's kind of a Bolt Hound kind of, you know, a bit of a Goblin Bushwhacker, you know, it's reminiscent of a few different cards. The only problem, or I guess what's better than some of those cards, is it's not as removable as, you know, just a creature some of the time. That's good. It gives your creatures haste, which is really sweet if you play this on turn 4 and like plus it or 0 it or whatever. And then the next turn, you again transmogrify, you know, and go get something that doesn't usually have haste. You can +1 to give it haste. I mean, this card works so well with Luca. It's unbelievable, but it's probably pretty decent in like mono red aggro decks too, where it's a creature factory for 0 loyalty. You know, infinite creatures. While this is out, it's pretty sweet. Or at least once a turn. And then, once you do have a gang of relatively small dudes, the Anthem effect becomes, like, very relevant. So, I actually like this more than I did on first read. I had to look at this a few times to really start liking it. But once you realize the things that it does work with, the fact that it probably does slot into an existing standard deck right now and make it much, much better, then I think that the card, like, starts earning some points in my book. Now, just because I say that things are the last card of the day doesn't mean it's true, because I actually missed a couple of green cards here, and I don't even know how I missed Froghemoth. It's kind of hard to miss, right? This is 5 mana, 3 and 2 green for a 4/4 Frog Horror with Trample and Haste. And when it deals combat damage to a player, exile up to that many cards from their graveyard. Put a +1/+1 counter on Froghemoth for each creature exiled this way. You gain 1 life for each non-creature card exiled this way. So it's a big, fat scavenging ooze, kind of, you know? Like, kind of, sort of scavenging ooze that probably won't see much play while scavenging ooze is in the format. But I might be very wrong, because another card I like to kind of compare this to is Goldspan Dragon. Seriously, I mean, it's a 5 mana, 4/4 haste with a semi, you know, a kind of evasive ability. It's not flying. It's nowhere near as good as flying, but your opponent's pretty incentivized to block this dude when he comes down, or it's going to get really big and mess around in their graveyard or whatever, which a lot of people really don't want. And if it does get through for any damage, it gets even bigger, right? So if it sticks around for a turn, it'll get huge. You know, I think this is actually, like, kind of playable. So, I don't know. I think that Froghemoth is actually a pretty sweet little Magic card. And even though it's no Goldspan Dragon, all things considered, like all things totaled up, I still think this could be a dangerous thing, in large part because of the haste. But the actual final card of the day is Varus Silvery Moon Ranger. This is 3 mana, 1 and 2 green for a 3/3 legendary human elf ranger. It has reach, and it also has ward 1. Randomly. Whenever you cast a creature or planeswalker spell, venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. Whenever you complete a dungeon, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. So what we have here is a 3 mana, 3/3 with 2 decent keyword abilities. Not amazing, but decent keyword abilities. That also has a trigger on it that lets you just venture at the one time a turn. I mean, casting a creature isn't going to be too hard to do. And even on turns where you rip a planeswalker, you know, play Vivian or Garruk or something. Then this also lets you venture. You will complete dungeons fairly fast this way if you're doing other things to, you know, venture. So, you know, if you venture with this guy on a turn and then you venture with something else on that same turn, then you're actually completing dungeons really quickly, meaning this will get you at least 1 body. This looks like it could be the pushed way to, you know, incentivize completing dungeons. I mean, it's not a terrible card. Doesn't die to Bone Crusher. That's a big deal in our format right now. And if they do want to target it with removal, it's going to cost an extra mana to play the removal spell. So I think this is actually kind of sweet. I'm not sure how good it is compared to some of the other three, green 3-drops. I do think there are just better options. But if you're looking to complete the dungeon specifically, again, I have some problems. I'm not sure that green is going to be the complete the dungeon color. I'm just not sure. But cards like this definitely pull it into being one of the dungeon-centric colors. And I could really see this being like the centerpiece to any good dungeon deck. So of all the things we've seen that venture into the dungeon and care about completing them, this does both and is actually looking pretty good on terms of rate. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all the cards from today, save for some really, really low impact stuff that we will cover in the best of the rest towards the end of the spoiler season. But there were a lot of pretty hype cards today, and I know that a lot of times I said, like, I don't know if this is good enough, I don't know if that is good enough. There are some cards that look very, very good. In the current standard right now, there's at least like 3 or 4 from this video that I can think of that might actually have a real impact on standards. So far, we've seen about a third of the set in just like 2 days. You really need to slow down, Wizards. Like, I know that I have a very unique position on this, being a content creator, but there's a lot of content creators out there. There are way more of us than there were just a couple of years ago, too. So these last few spoiler seasons, Wizards, where you put out 40 cards on day 1, 60 cards on day 2, 60 cards on day 3, they're killing us. Those spoiler seasons are killing us as content creators. I don't know what happened to a 2-week spoiler season, but I want it back. Let me just make my stance on this very clear in case anyone cares out there, or if you're watching at Wizards, and I know that you are. I happen to know that you, in fact, somebody is. Whose decision was it to do 4 and 5 day spoiler seasons where you release like 100 cards at a time? Stop doing that. Aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications because there's more spoilers. And when the whole set's out, we got the top 10 sleepers, top 25 cards, decks and stuff. I mean, you want to be a part of the channel. Even if you don't subscribe to YouTube content very often, it would mean a lot to me if you would do it this one time. Aside from that, I mean, of course it would, right? But aside from that, you can watch me play Magic over here on Twitch. You can support the channel for $1 a month on Patreon, and that'll let you know, or let you vote on what decks we'll do next season. And you can also follow me on Twitter if you really feel like it. Okay, if you want to. I'm on there sometimes. But aside from that, I'm done for this one. And I've got to get to editing, so this video comes out before midnight. I love you all. And I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.